A console dies twice. First, the manufacturer stops building it. Years later, the final game arrives, the shelves empty, and its controller is packed into a box for good. But 4 consoles refused that second death. Developers kept squeezing new games onto hardware that stores had abandoned, companies had buried, and sometimes entire generations had forgotten. If you want to uncover more gaming stories that refuse to stay buried, subscribe to Cartridge Graveyard. One machine survived 6 years beyond its cancellation. Another received a brand new cartridge more than 3 decades after production ended. But the strangest case is not just about nostalgia. It reveals why a supposedly obsolete console can become more valuable to developers after it dies. The Nintendo Wii looked unstoppable in 2009. It had entered nursing homes, bowling leagues, family rooms, and homes whose owners had never considered buying a console. Nintendo ultimately sold more than 101 million units. But success created a strange problem. Millions of Wii owners were not waiting for complex adventures or cutting-edge graphics. They wanted something immediate, social, and easy to understand. Ubisoft had exactly that. Just Dance launched for the Wii in November 2009, using the Wii Remote to track movement while players copied dancers on screen. Critics were not especially impressed, but families did not care. The game sold millions, so annual sequels followed. Meanwhile, the industry moved forward. Nintendo released the Wii U in 2012, Wii production largely ended in 2013, and the Nintendo Switch arrived in 2017. By that point, the Wii was 2 generations behind. Its standard video output topped out at 480p. Its online services were disappearing. GameStop shelves had shrunk to a few faded plastic cases, but in November 2019, Ubisoft released Just Dance 2020 on Wii. Not Wii U, Wii. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions sat beside a game designed for hardware from 2006. Nintendo had already sold more than 41 million Switch systems, but Ubisoft knew something the rest of the industry had missed. A large group of Just Dance players had no reason to upgrade. The Wii Remote already worked. The console was already connected to the family television. Grandparents and younger children did not care about frame rates, teraflops, or ray tracing. They cared that pressing one button started the music. So the Wii's weakness became its protection. Its audience was technologically static, but commercially useful. Just Dance 2020 became Ubisoft's final Wii release, arriving roughly 6 years after Nintendo ended production and nearly 13 years after the console launched. That sounds impressive, but the Wii had sold over 100 million units. Our next console survived with a much smaller audience, because its death accidentally gave independent developers exactly what they needed. Sega launched the Dreamcast in Japan in 1998 and North America in 1999. It offered online play, arcade-quality graphics, and wonderfully strange games such as Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, and Seaman. But Sony's PlayStation 2 hype was overwhelming. Sega was financially wounded, and Dreamcast sales never reached the scale required to save the company's hardware business. On January 31, 2001, Sega announced that Dreamcast production would end. The console was barely 2 years old in North America. For most machines, that would have triggered a rapid collapse, but Dreamcast software kept appearing. Sega released major games such as Sonic Adventure 2 after the announcement. Japanese publishers went further, supporting the system through a loyal audience of arcade and shoot-'em-up fans. Trigger Heart Excellica arrived in 2007. Cruise followed in Japan on March 8 of that year, 6 years after Sega had announced the console's cancellation. But even Cruise was not really the end. The Dreamcast used a format called GD-ROM, but many units could also read MIL CDs, a feature originally intended for multimedia discs. Developers discovered that this made it possible to create software that booted without an official Sega license. The closed platform became unusually accessible at precisely the moment Sega stopped controlling it. Independent studios began producing professionally packaged Dreamcast games. Last Hope, Deux, Stormwind, and Xenocrisis arrived long after retail stores had declared the machine dead. Some were pressed onto discs with full-color manuals and jewel cases, recreating the feeling of buying a new Dreamcast release years after the final Dreamcast had left the factory. The contradiction is important. Sega's exit reduced the commercial value of the console, but it increased its cultural value. Dreamcast owners became collectors, collectors became a dependable niche market, and developers no longer had to compete with Sega's biggest releases. A game selling a few thousand copies could disappear on a modern storefront, but on Dreamcast, it became an event. Still, discs are relatively easy to manufacture. Producing a new cartridge for obsolete hardware is harder, especially when that hardware belongs to Sega's previous generation. The Sega Genesis launched in Japan as the Mega Drive in 1988 and reached North America in 1989. Its battle with the Super Nintendo defined the early 1990s, but by the time 3D graphics took over, the Genesis seemed firmly trapped in the past. Sega stopped supporting it, retailers moved on, and its black cartridges migrated from bedroom shelves to flea market bins. But in 2004, developer Watermelon began working on something absurd, a completely new role-playing game for the Genesis. The project took years. When Pure Solar and the Great Architects finally shipped in 2010, the Genesis had been commercially obsolete for well over a decade. Pure Solar was not a tiny demo or a recycled prototype. It was an original role-playing game built around a 64-megabit cartridge, unusually large for the hardware, with elaborate pixel art and an optional soundtrack disc that used the Sega CD attachment. Its existence proved that retro development could be more than a hobby. Crowdfunding, online storefronts, and global collector communities had created a small alternative economy. The publisher no longer needed to convince Walmart to stock a Genesis cartridge. It only needed enough committed buyers willing to order one directly. But that freedom came with danger. Another Genesis project, Paprium, promised a massive beat-em-up and raised enormous expectations. After long delays, silence, and controversy, some cartridges finally reached customers in late 2020. The game looked impossible for the hardware, but the chaotic release exposed the other side of resurrecting dead consoles. Old components are scarce. Manufacturing custom cartridges is expensive. A tiny team can face the logistical burden of a major publisher without the staff, money, or trust needed to survive mistakes. So the Genesis did not merely receive games after death. It became a test of whether passion could rebuild an entire supply chain. But no console pushed that idea further than a machine released before the Genesis, before the Nintendo Entertainment System, and before many of today's developers were born. The Atari Video Computer System arrived in 1977. Later renamed the Atari 2600, it helped turn interchangeable game cartridges into a mass-market business. Its hardware was astonishingly limited. The console had just 128 bytes of RAM, not kilobytes. Bytes. A modern high-resolution photograph can contain millions of times more data than the 2600 could hold in active memory. Atari continued producing versions of the system until 1992, giving it an extraordinary commercial lifespan. But after production stopped, the console survived through homebrew developers. Programmers learned to manipulate its television interface adapter line by line, racing the electron beam of old televisions to create images the hardware was never designed to store normally. New homebrew cartridges appeared for years, but in 2023, the story crossed from fan culture back into official history. Atari released Mr. Run and Jump for the Atari 2600 as a physical cartridge. The game came in a newly manufactured box with a manual, just as a retail Atari game might have decades earlier. It was not simply an old prototype discovered in a warehouse. It was a new title adapted for hardware that had debuted 46 years earlier. Think about that gap. Someone who received an Atari 2600 at age 10 in 1977 could buy a new game for it at age 56. Entire companies had risen and vanished in between. Arcades had peaked. Nintendo, Sega, Sony, and Microsoft had fought multiple console wars. Games had moved from cartridges to discs, from discs to downloads, and from downloads to streaming. But the Atari still accepted a plastic cartridge pushed into the same slot. That is the biggest reason dead consoles keep receiving games. Modern platforms offer power, but old platforms offer boundaries. When a developer has only 128 bytes of RAM, every animation becomes a puzzle. When the audience is small, every buyer feels visible. When no one expects a new release, simply making one becomes meaningful. These consoles were not kept alive by technology. They were kept alive by people who refused to let convenience erase attachment. A dead system is just a silent piece of plastic, but one new game can make its power light feel magical again. Which discontinued console would you want to receive one final game? Share your choice, and subscribe if you believe old hardware still has new stories left to tell.